copy?
The first type of communication that we're going to cover is nonverbal communication. This form has been popularized by many video games and is generally seen in the use of hand signals. Now, nonverbal communication is essential, and it's important that you're well versed with the hand signals used by your fire team and the other personnel who you'll be operating with. However, it is very much a niche form of communication on the battlefield, primarily used only under very specific circumstances. One of the instances where you will need to use nonverbal communication, such as hand signals, is any time where silence is the primary directive that's dictating your motions. So whenever you need to conceal your movements by the use of noise discipline, that is when you'd use hand signals. Instances might be during night operations or approaching doors in an urban environment prior to breaching. Whenever the enemy is not aware of your presence and you don't want them to be, you should use silent methods of communication. Noise discipline, as I mentioned before, is a concept that applies here. This means your radios might be turned down or completely off. So you'll be relying completely on nonverbal forms of communication, especially hand signals. It's important to remember that hand signals vary from fire team to fire team. However, there are core and basic hand signals that we will refer to throughout these video segments, and that is the basis to work off of as far as working with hand signals for the airsoft operations underneath the SOCOM umbrella. An example to kind of illustrate when you'd use this would be a night operation or early morning operation where you are to strike a compound or a known enemy position. Once you've achieved your strike point, you will most likely send someone out to recon and see what the enemy is doing. Now, this person is going to get very close, and so it's important that they don't make lots of noises to alert the enemy to their presence. However, you should be able to still see them from your vantage point. At this point, it is up to your reconnaissance person to relay information back to you silently. This would be a perfect opportunity to use hand signals to do that. Another case in point would be any time where you are sneaking about, as it were, and you need to relay that important communication that we always refer to the rest of your fire team. One final point I want to make with hand signals is keeping them in context and keeping them brief as well. You need to communicate the information that's important as simply as possible to avoid confusion. This means sticking to the predetermined hand signals for this operation. Before operations commence during your initial briefing, it is up to the fire team leader or other personnel in charge to pre-select important hand signals that everyone needs to know. Some of these hand signals would be things such as you have identified the location of a VIP, or you have identified the location of the mission objective. This is something that everyone needs to know, and that there's no chance that anyone will forget in the heat of the moment. That's why it's important to go over these in the pre-mission briefing with everyone that's going to be involved in the operation. Moving on to verbal communication, this is probably the most common and most effective way to communicate on the battlefield. It can take shape from anything from yelling for help to your comrades to calling in for airstrikes or artillery missions over a radio network. There's some very basic and essential principles that you must adhere to keep your radio and verbal communications effective, and we're going to cover those. The three core principles that I want to discuss in depth when it comes to communication are accuracy, brevity, and clarity.
Saber actual, Raptor 2 is hot.
Accuracy. This is the first and probably the most important element when communicating. It's absolutely essential that you are completely accurate in any communication you relay back to the members of your fire team as well as your command. It's important that this is accurate for several reasons. The information that you relay will dictate certain decisions they make based on the combat environment. If you report inaccurate information, it might cause them to commit reinforcements to your position when they're not needed, or allocate air resources where they're not actually necessary. This will leave these resources unavailable to other personnel in the battle space who might need them more critically based on their situation.
Bangalore 5, this is Thunder 2, do you copy?
Brevity, as the word implies, means to keep it brief. It's essential that you don't inundate the command with useless information. Some examples of information that detract from the brevity of a communication would be filler words such as, or Take the time before you start talking to make sure that you just communicate a concise and almost bulleted list of what they need to know back to command. Some other examples are things that aren't relevant to the combat situation, such as if you are tired or hungry or need a drink of water. That doesn't matter. What matters is what the enemy is doing and how it affects your operational goals. That's what you need to communicate. When you're taking information and preparing to communicate it, whether it's simply relaying back to your fire team which direction you're about to bound, or as a fire team leader, you are relaying your need for reinforcements or air cover, it's imperative that you do this as brief as possible. Keeping it brief will eliminate the opportunity for confusion and for the important details to get lost in the sauce. So in essence, to sum up what we are talking about when we refer to brevity in the context of battlefield communication, you need to communicate the maximum amount of imperative information with the minimal amount of words used to communicate that information. You need to say as much as possible, as simply as possible. And that's the final word on brevity.
Saber actual, Raptor 2 is hot.
Now clarity is the quality at which you verbally communicate. What that means is that you take the time to enunciate in a way that the radio or your comrades will be able to understand what you're saying. If you're screaming hysterically for covering fire from your position back to your comrades, there's a significant chance they will not be able to understand what you actually need. And you will definitely damage their cool factor when they see you are panicking completely in front of them. This will have a very negative effect overall. Not only will you be unable to communicate effectively, your comrades and your fire team will be a little unsure of your combat effectiveness when they see you lose your cool completely. Clarity is most important, however, when it comes to using radios or other forms of electronic or digital communications. If you're not very clear in the way you speak into the radio, after that signal is busy being transferred into electronic signal and back into voice on the other end, there's a good chance they won't be able to understand what you're saying, which means they'll have to ask you to repeat it, which means you'll have to repeat it, which is lost time. This could be lethal if what you're communicating is time sensitive, for instance calling for artillery to shield a withdrawal. When it comes to clarity, there's some basic things to remember. If you take a breath in between each sentence or each word, it'll make you think more about what you're saying, and it will also cause you to speak more distinctly and to the point. Whenever you're using a push-to-talk system, make sure that you push the button and wait at least a little bit to make sure that you don't cut yourself off at the beginning, and when you're done communicating, continue to hold the button down for a little bit longer to make sure you don't cut off the end of what you're trying to communicate. Your communication may be very accurate as to the detail of the situation. However, if you fail to be clear, it won't do anyone any good because they won't understand what you're trying to say. Your communication could be incredibly brief and have all the essential details. However, once again, if no one can understand what you're saying, it won't do anyone any good. All it will do is waste your time and give you the false impression that help is coming or that your communication has been relayed, while you've simply left the rest of your fire team and the command structure confused as to what your situation actually is. Another important principle, besides the top three when it comes to communication, is structure and formatting. Now for our uses, this is going to be very simple. We're just going to use the "Hey you, this is me" format. What that means is, when you initiate communication, you first address the person you are trying to reach by their call sign, which is pre-designated before the operation begins. After you initiate this communication by using their call sign, you refer to yourself so they know who they are talking to. At that point, you will wait for them to reply. When you reply, you use the inverse of the previous described format. "Hey, you, this is me." This would sound something to the extent of, if you had a fire team calling for fire support, "Puff the Magic Dragon, this is Ground Pounder 1. Do you copy?" Puff the Magic Dragon is who you, the ground pounder, is calling for air support or artillery support. After you have initiated the communication by calling their call sign and stating who is trying to communicate with them, you will then indicate that the communication is over. This can be done by the use of specific key terms or simply stating that it's over. Puff the Magic Dragon, this is Ground Pounder 1, over. That will allow them to know that the line is open for them to respond and indicate that they have heard your communique. If you are Puff the Magic Dragon and you are receiving this, you would reply, Ground Pounder 1, this is Puff the Magic Dragon, go ahead. Or something to that extent. The important thing to remember is that once again you use the proper format. When you are applying communication, it's important that you once again make sure that the person you're talking to knows you're talking to them by using their call sign. Relay who you are by using your call sign, and then allow them to know that you have received their initial contact and are awaiting them to continue with their communication. So, in our example, after Puff the Magic Dragon relays that it heard Ground Pounder 1, Ground Pounder 1 then would reinitiate communication with Puff the Magic Dragon and communicate their needs for air support or an artillery strike. This would sound something to the extent of, Puff the Magic Dragon, this is Ground Pounder 1. We need a fire mission on such and such coordinates. Over. At that point, Puff the Magic Dragon would relay that they understood and that they were sending the airstrike or whatever the situation dictated. The key when using this format is to just make sure that the person you're talking to knows that you are trying to communicate with them and that they understand who is trying to contact them. This is achieved by using the "Hey you, this is me" format. This brings us to the topic of call signs. Now this might be one of the first things that when you get involved in airsoft that you do is pick your call sign. However, in reality, call signs vary greatly from operation to operation. I've had over 15 call signs in my very short military career. And currently I have 3 that are active on any given operation based on who's trying to contact me. Now this might seem confusing, however, it's all predictated by operating procedures before a military operation begins. This will be the same for our purposes. Before an airsoft operation commences, your fire team will meet with your command structure to select call signs for this operation. Now for our purposes, the personal call signs will most likely remain the same. Others will vary greatly. These will include things such as VIPs, targets of interest, points of interest, enemy positions, enemy objectives, as well as support elements such as air elements and artillery and mortar positions. And it's very important, especially for the fire team leader, that he is able to commit these call signs to memory so he's not fumbling for a notebook when he needs to call for fires or air support. It's also important that everyone else takes note so that they will be able to effectively communicate if they have to take up the position of radioman and communicate needs back to the command structure. Call signs should be simple, effective, and easy to remember. Generally speaking, it's also easy if you use some form of connective memory with a call sign. What I mean by that is, if it flies, give it a call sign of something that flies. If it rolls along the ground, try and give it a call sign that will remind you that you're calling for tank or artillery, and try and give aircraft a call sign that will remind you that you're calling for an airstrike. The same principle goes for VIPs, points of interest, and mission objectives as well. Whenever communications are a critical part of an operation, counter communications or electronic warfare also will be. If there is a known or possible threat that your communication network might be compromised and the enemy might be listening, the inverse of everything we just covered should be taken. What I mean when I say that is if it flies, don't give it a call sign that relates to something that flies. If it rolls along the ground, don't give the call sign that might hint that it's a tank. Misinformation with call signs can be just as important as connective memory when it comes to call signs. If there's a chance the enemy might be listening, take every step to make sure he doesn't know what you're doing. One last note that is related to call signs are mission-specific terms and phrases. This is very important for clandestine operations. A mission-specific term or phrase is a pre-memorized phrase that says one thing but means something else. A good example of this was during World War II, during Operation Market Garden and the other airborne operations prior to the D-Day invasion. The airborne soldiers were instructed to challenge anyone they met with a specific phrase. thunder. The correct reply is flash. If they didn't hear flash, they're going to shoot that guy. This is a perfect example. These phrases can be used to accomplish security, friend or foe identification, or to be able to effectively relay communication back simpler. For instance, if the mission operation is to identify a certain person moving a certain direction, that's a great deal of information to relay. However, to say that the cat's out of the bag, and everyone knows that the cat's out of the bag means that same thing, that's much more concise. It will also keep the enemy from being aware of what your operational goals are, whether or not they've been achieved, and what you plan to do next. Once again, it is extremely important that if any of these are used, that everyone's aware of what they are before the mission starts.